Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here for this very special event, a celebration of a series of academic achievements here at the University of Edinburgh. My name is Professor Jeremy Corrett, the head of the School of Divinity, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural lecture for Professor Matthew Noverson in honour of his appointment to the Chair of Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities. It is indeed great to see you all on such a special occasion. A particular delight to welcome two special guests, Michelle, Professor Noverson's wife, and Ben, Professor Noverson's son. It's really a special moment for us that you share this with us. Welcome. I'd also like to welcome Professor David Smith, Deputy Head of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Science, representing the College here this evening. Thank you, David, for joining us for this event. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming here this evening, whether you've come from the city of Edinburgh or more further afield. It's great that you share this event with us. And in order for this event to happen, for it to be a possibility, I want to thank Pippa, who's been working very hard on organising it this evening, also to Rory, who is behind there in the camera, and to Kathy, who has been overviewing the whole event. Thank you for making it possible for us all this evening. Thank you all very much. And now to the main focus of this evening. It is a moment of celebration, a celebration of academic achievement in achieving the professorial status. And it's my pleasure, as part of that tradition, to say a few words before handing over to Professor Noverson and to give a little context to his own work. Professor Noverson came to Edinburgh in 2012 as lecturer. He then became senior lecturer in 2015, and he held many visiting appointments during that time to Duke University, Dartmouth College, Durham University, and the University of Cambridge. And he was appointed to the Chair of Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities in August 2023. He was awarded the 2018 Thomas Reid Medal from the Royal Society of Edinburgh and is co-director with Professor Helen Bond for the Centre for the Study of Christian Origins at Edinburgh. And he has supervised numerous Edinburgh PhD students, many of whom I can see are here this evening. His research focuses on religion in antiquity, especially Judaism and Christianity in the ancient Mediterranean, and in particular, biblical and related literature in ancient contexts and in modern criticism. He is known above all for his research on ancient Jewish messianism and on the letters of Paul. His esteemed publications include Christ Among the Messiahs in 2012, The Grammar of Messianism in 2017, Paul Then and Now in 2022. He is also co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Pauline Studies in 2022, and his forthcoming work, Paul and Judaism at the End of History, will come out with Cambridge University Press in July this year. In these rich scholarly works, Professor Noverson has redefined fields and inspired an international audience of scholars. Even if I were a biblical scholar, which I'm not, one could not begin to go through all of the specific aspects of those works and capture the depth and range of his thinking on messianism and Paul. But from the outside, I'd like to offer one appreciative gloss, looking in from the margins, an appreciation of the brilliance of his approach, because it shows why Professor Noverson is not only an original scholar, but also an inspiring teacher and an engaging colleague. And it, indeed, is his ability to take us beyond the immediate, which I want to talk about, beyond the immediate text and beyond the immediate interpretation to something that we have missed, an alternative. This ability to identify the alternative is an insight which I've also appreciated in the school management group for actually defining some key issues and how we operate in the school. But it's also the quality that comes through his scholarship. What is striking is that Professor Noverson is very self-conscious in his writing and his approach. And he is aware that he operates within and beyond what he defines as the conventional scholarship in his field. He holds the conventional tools. Historical, philological, and literary thinking are all found within the field of biblical studies, Jewish studies, and classics. But he takes us beyond these into a different direction. Let me give but one example to illuminate. In his analysis of both the primary texts and the scholars in the study of Messianism, he's able to reveal what he calls in Christ Among the Messiahs, and I quote, the conceptual misstep of previous studies. Or, as he says in the Grammar of Messianism, his ability to offer, and I quote again, a demonstration of an alternative, a better way of conceiving, not least for reading the particular linguistic questions. In this instance, the Messiah language and the syntax of that language. So while, as he concedes, his approach is going beyond that conventional approach, beyond the historical critical paradigm, we are constantly moved along in a new direction, into very different kinds of questions that are often unpredicted. He enables us to understand how ideas are intelligible in their historical context. But he does not simply stop at that insight, but he rather, again, moves us along beyond that conventional approach by unfolding what he sees, and I quote, as the discursive possibilities and constraints of the ideas of Messianism. And it is that ability to move us beyond which I want to focus on. In short, he has the unusual capacity to show a sensitivity to both the philosophy of Wittgenstein and the ancient world at the same time. And that is no small feat. To take us to the new possibilities in thinking is the force of his intellectual endeavor. In this sense, we might note that there are few scholars who, like Professor Noverson, can make the title of their book a thesis, as he says, with a suppressed verb, the grammar of Messianism. The thesis with a suppressed verb in the very title of the work. It is that ability to show us what texts do in all of their complexity that is so inspiring. Seen again in his study, Paul, Then and Now, where there is precisely the same sensitivity to language in showing how the interpreter makes Paul speak, showing how Paul's words speak in the vast history of interpretations of Paul. He shows us, as he says, why it is worth paying attention, not just to Paul, but always to that which is different and unexpected. The capacity to illuminate, then also move us beyond to another place, is precisely why Professor Noverson has inspired so many PhD students over numerous decades. And we might say that he has created a dynamic community of discursive possibilities among his students. His inaugural lecture tonight, The Bad Bible in the 21st Century, equally holds the same possibility of moving us beyond and showing us the capacity to read, interpret, and understand in new ways. Would you all welcome to the platform for his inaugural lecture, Professor Matthew Noverson, Chair of Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities. Professor Noverson.
Well, Deputy Head of College and Head of School, staff colleagues, students, past and present, friends and family, especially Michelle and Ben. Hi there. I'm very grateful to you all for coming out this evening to help me celebrate this happy occasion. It is a great honor to give an inaugural professorial lecture, and all the more so to give one in this great and historic university. I do not take for granted either the opportunity itself or your choice to honor me with your presence. And on this day, which of course happens to be both Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day, so whether you are a pious person or a romantic person, or both, or neither, I appreciate that you'll be giving up something to be here, and I'll try to make it worth your while. As you may have gathered from my accents, I'm American by birth and upbringing, and so when I contemplate giving an inaugural lecture at the University of Edinburgh, I cannot help but think of the words of another American, much more famous than I, on the occasion of another lecture at this university. William James, in the first of his Edinburgh Gifford lectures in 1901, opened with these words: "It is with no small amount of trepidation that I take my place behind this desk and face this learned audience. To us Americans, the experience of receiving instruction from the living voice as well as from the books of European scholars is very familiar. It seems the natural thing for us to listen whilst the Europeans talk. The contrary habit of talking whilst the Europeans listen we have not yet acquired. And in him who first makes the adventure, it begets a certain sense of apology being due for so presumptuous an act. Particularly must this be the case on a soil as sacred to the American imagination as that of Edinburgh." End quote. Now, like William James, I am an American, although unlike James, I'm also a Briton and a Scot by immigration and naturalization, but I think I understand the feeling of trepidation that he describes. Since for scholars of religion, and in particular of the Bible, Edinburgh is sacred soil indeed. Speaking of which, some people have asked me, some of you have asked me, about the name of this chair, Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities, which strikes some ears as one, a mouthful, and two, rather old-fashioned. And indeed it is both, but there are good reasons for this. A few of you may have institutional memory long enough to recall these reasons, but most will not, and so I'm going to explain. Almost 200 years ago, in 1827, the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the state of the universities of Scotland resolved, among the many resolutions reached during its 5-year tenure, that there should be established a Regius Chair of Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities at the University of Edinburgh. This, the early 19th century, was effectively the dawn of critical study of the Bible in European universities. More on that development later. And so there was established such a chair, although, interestingly, it took some time. The first person nominated, Robert Candlish, minister of St. George's Church, which is now the West Register House on Charlotte Square, had his candidacy vetoed in the House of Lords on account of his politics. The new Regius Chair was, at last, filled in 1846 by Robert Lee, who was minister of Old Greyfriars Church, which is still Greyfriars Church, though now it is also a pilgrimage site for Harry Potter tourists. This Robert Lee would be the first of 6 incumbents in the Regius Chair, which lasted for over a century until it was vacated in 1954, 70 years ago, and not filled again thereafter. So allow me to say just a word about these distinguished incumbents. So a little slice of Edinburgh divinity history here. About the aforementioned Robert Lee, the first to hold the chair from 1846 to 1868. One of his students reminisced that, quote, "The classroom of biblical criticism was the most lively of them all. Lee's lectures were clear, instructive, tolerant, and decided. It was curious to see the volume in which they were handsomely bound, brought in and laid on the desk by his stately servitor, and then read straight on as they had been for many years before," end quote. Now, as it happens, the student who told that story about Lee was also Lee's successor in the Regis chair, Archibald Hamilton Charteris, who held the chair from 1868 to 1898, and whose portrait hangs in Rainey Hall in New College. It's actually the first one you see when you come in the door, this portrait. You might recognize Charteris's name from the Charteris Center over on the Pleasance. That building is called the Charteris Center because it abuts the old St. Ninian's Mission and the Deaconess Hospital, which are now both University of Edinburgh students' accommodation. Some of you perhaps live in those buildings. Both of which Charteris founded in his energetic efforts to expand women's ministry in the Church of Scotland. Charteris was succeeded in the chair by John Patrick, chair from 1898 to 1915, the most theologically conservative of the bunch. He gave the Kroll lectures for 1899 to 1900 on Clement of Alexandria. In the last of which lectures, he writes, slightly off topic from the lecture itself, quote, "The fundamental question is whether we are to regard Scripture as primarily the record of man's interest in God or God's interest in man. If the former conception be adopted as primary, the Scriptures are only of interest in the history of religion. But if the latter conception be adopted, we have a revelation of and from God, rightfully claiming to furnish an authoritative rule for faith and life." Patrick was succeeded in the chair by William Alexander Curtis, chair from 1915 to 1946. Curtis oversaw the unification of the University Faculty of Divinity with New College, becoming in 1935 both dean of the faculty and principal of New College. Today, he looks sternly down at PhD students undergoing their vivas in the New College Senate room. Curtis was succeeded by William Manson, chair from 1946 to 52, who moved laterally within the faculty from the established chair in New Testament language, literature, and theology, which he had already held for some 2 decades by that point. Manson is well known for his research on the Gospels. For instance, his 1940 Cunningham lectures, Jesus the Messiah, the synoptic tradition of the revelation of God in Christ, with special reference to form criticism. But among Edinburgh Divinity students, Manson seems to have been best known for his bashful personality. At an event to mark the end of the 1940 academic year, a student wrote and performed this little song about Manson. I don't know the tune, so I won't sing, but I will read the lyrics. "Professor Manson is shyer than you or I are. He'll join that bright choir with no hint of disgrace, so spotless his way that there's nothing to say." Manson retired in 1952, and the Regis Chair of Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities found its last incumbent in Matthew Black, chair from 1952 to 54. Black was a brilliant ancient language polymath from Kilmarnock, and one of the editors of the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament that we all still use to this day. This is the editorial committee of the little blue Nestle Aland New Testament with Matthew Black, second from the left. Black, however, departed Edinburgh for the chair of biblical criticism at the University of St. Andrews, where he would teach till his retirement in 1978. And meanwhile, back in Edinburgh, the Regis chair went unfilled from 1954 onward. Now, I am sure that our mid-20th century predecessors in the Faculty of Divinity had their reasons, but I have always thought it a shame that this Regius Chair, whose occupants were very important in the history of modern British and European biblical studies, was allowed simply to lapse. And so I thought some years ago that if I ever had the privilege to be appointed to a professorial chair at Edinburgh, then I would want it to be a chair of biblical criticism and biblical antiquities. The name is a mouthful, but it captures pretty well what I do, and it locates me and this faculty within the disciplinary tradition of which we are part. So in this inaugural lecture, I'd like to illustrate for you biblical criticism, that is our modern strategies for interpreting biblical texts, and biblical antiquities, that is the ancient Mediterranean and West Asian worlds in which the texts were written, through one interesting and contemporary test case, namely the phenomenon of the bad Bible in the 21st century. Now, if you saw my lecture title advertised, you might have come along this evening hoping, or perhaps fearing, that I would argue that the Bible is bad, which is not the meaning of my title. My project, rather, is to show you a discourse in contemporary scholarship that does roughly make that argument, and then to subject that discourse to a bit of criticism, and finally to show you a more excellent way. Now, perhaps the most famous example of a bad Bible is the so-called Wicked Bible, a 1631 printing of the King James Version, published in London by the royal printers Barker and Lucas. It is called the Wicked Bible because of a notorious typo, the accidental omission of the word "not" in the text of Exodus 20:14, so that the seventh commandment of the Decalogue reads, "Thou shalt commit adultery." Suitable for Valentine's Day, maybe. Funny to us, perhaps. It is funny to me. But it was not funny to Robert Barker and Martin Lucas, the printers, who were made to pay handsomely for their crime of typography. Commenting on the incident several decades later, in 1668, Peter Heylin wrote this: "His Majesty's printers, at or about this time, had committed a scandalous mistake in our English Bibles by leaving out the word "not" in the seventh commandment. His Majesty," that is Charles I, "being made acquainted with it by the Bishop of London, order was given for calling the printers into the High Commission, whereupon the evidence of the fact, the whole impression, was called in, and the printers were deeply fined as they justly merited." End quote. It's a dangerous business, you see, printing Bibles. Now, the bad Bible in the 21st century is a very different kind of thing, a matter not of typography, but rather of hermeneutics, which is to say, of interpretation. The Wicked Bible of 1631 was called wicked because more or less all parties to the affair agreed that whatever the Bible taught, in this instance, "thou shalt not commit adultery," was righteous, and the opposite thereof, "thou shalt commit adultery," wicked. In the 21st century, by contrast, there is no consensus in favor of the moral rectitude of the Bible. And indeed, in some quarters, there is a critical mass of opinion against it. The text of the Bible has remained more or less the same. I say more or less. Some of you are textual critics and will know the many exceptions. But our cultural posture toward the Bible has changed. So much so, in fact, that what were widely regarded, even just a decade or two ago, as good, progressive, liberative readings of certain biblical texts are now criticized as self-serving, apologetic, dishonest, even as a cover for violence. Now, I happen to be just old enough to have experienced this hermeneutical whiplash firsthand during my career so far, which is why I find this so very interesting. Like our forebears 20 years ago, and our forebears 400 years ago. We, most of us, I think, would want, in principle, to be on the side of ethical interpretation of the Bible, but what counts as ethical interpretation has changed, is changing in real time, so that criticism itself sometimes struggles to keep up. There is a fascinating disciplinary backstory to all this. There was an 18th century moment before modern biblical criticism became what it overwhelmingly became over the course of the 19th century and following, when moral criticism of the Bible was at the top of the Enlightenment agenda. Among the myriad examples we could cite, consider just the following. The English deist Thomas Chubb, commenting on God's notorious command to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, Genesis 22, reasons this way, quote, "In the nature of the thing, the moral unfitness of the action, as in the present case it must appear to be, was a stronger reason against the divinity of that command than any of those extraordinary ways in which that command was conveyed to him, whether by dream, vision, divine voice, etc., could possibly be for it. Miracles," Thomas Chubb argues, "are directly and immediately evidences only of the power, not of the veracity or goodness of the agent that performs them," end quote. So note the cutting edge of Thomas Chubb's question, not when, where, how, or whether the thing happened, but whether the deity who supposedly commanded it can possibly be credited with either veracity or goodness. Now, of course, the near sacrifice of Isaac is a, and perhaps the, classic case of putative biblical immorality, as famously in Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. But in this 18th century critical ferment, even other more quotidian immoralities were called on the carpet. The Huguenot skeptic Pierre Bayle, in his Historical and Critical Dictionary, objects to the apparently gratuitous cruelty of King David in his military expeditions into neighboring nations in 2 Samuel 8 and 12. Bayle writes, "Can this method of making war be denied to be blameworthy? Have not the Turks and the Tartars more humanity? And if a vast number of pamphlets daily complain of the military execution of our own time, which are really cruel and highly to be blamed, though mild in comparison to David's, what would not the authors of those pamphlets say at this day, had they such usage to censure as the saws, harrows, and brick kilns of David, the general slaughter of all males, both old and young? If the people of Syria had been as great writers of libels as Europeans at this day, they would have strangely disfigured David's glory," end quote. Now, Bayle here makes precisely the move that is so much debated in our popular discourse nowadays. He knowingly applies his own contemporary moral standards to an ancient figure who presumably did not share those standards, and he finds him wanting. For Bayle, this is what biblical criticism consists in. Immanuel Kant, too, recognized the priority of the moral over the historical in biblical criticism, although Kant was much more sanguine than the earlier deists were about the Bible's chances of standing up under moral critique. Kant writes, quote, "It matters little that scholars who investigate the Bible's origin theoretically and historically and study its historical content critically may find it more or less wanting in proofs from a theoretical point of view. The divinity of its moral content adequately compensates reason for the humanity of its historical narrative, which, like an old parchment that is illegible in places, has to be made intelligible by adjustments and conjectures consistent with the whole," end quote. By the early 19th century, however, when chairs like Edinburgh's Regis Chair of Biblical Criticism and Biblical Antiquities were being established all across Europe, the discipline of biblical studies had already taken a sharp turn to the historical, as the quote from Kant already illustrates. This turn was not engineered by any kind of centralized academic magisterium, but it did serve the interests of the many pious Christian scholars who occupied those chairs. Stephen Moore and Yvonne Sherwood have written incisively about this disciplinary development. They say, quote, "Questions of historical possibility were easier to deal with than questions of moral possibility. In a strategic forgetting, the kind of enlightenment emblematized by the name of Kant was eclipsed by that emblematized by the name of Darwin. The problem of the miraculous became the paramount problem, a form of deviation from the general laws of nature that stood in for and displaced the problem of moral deviation." And again, they write, "The seemingly tragic tale of faith dashed on the hard rock of fact was actually a relatively happy one for many biblical critics, because by confining the could it have happened question to the realm of historical or scientific evidence, it gave the biblical God a fighting chance of surviving the impact." And once more, they write, "It is almost as though the 19th century expansion and consolidation of biblical criticism in scientific and historicist modes was designed to avoid uncomfortable moral questions by expending huge scholarly effort elsewhere. And once that tendency took hold, its grip proved extraordinarily tenacious." Tenacious indeed. My published work to date, for instance, has been almost entirely historical in its focus. And yet, in our current disciplinary moment, circa 2024, more than a few scholars have earnestly, even enthusiastically, taken up the mantle of moral criticism of the Bible, often simultaneously writing obituaries for historical criticism. If our 19th century forebears tiptoed around moral criticism of the Bible, then it appears to me we have well and truly gotten over that particular hang-up. Now, I'm referring here not to the familiar, especially post-9/11 new atheist complaints about an immoral Bible. Think Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and others likewise. Those complaints, in my view, were always very hermeneutically unsophisticated, and they have been expertly dealt with by my former Edinburgh colleague, David Ferguson, in this book. No, I am referring here to current 2020's discussion by leading scholars trained in the history, languages, and interpretation of biblical texts. People who know their Aramaic from their Arabic, their Rorty from their Rakur, and this, I think, makes their moral indignation all the more interesting than that of a Richard Dawkins, for instance. This current Bad Bible project starts off where many of us start, by considering some classically problematic biblical text, for instance, on women or enslaved persons or warfare or divine violence. Now, from there, an interpreter can go in any one of a number of hermeneutical directions. But the scholars I'm considering in this lecture make the same two decisive moves. First, they assert that to interpret the text correctly is just to call it out. And then second, they criticize other scholars' attempts at a liberative reading as somehow morally compromised. Allow me to illustrate from recent criticism of the letters of Paul, a part of the Christian Bible which has been a research focus of mine. So I'll give you a few examples of some scholars for whom I have tremendous respect, although I'm about to disagree with them on one issue. In an authoritative 2017 essay in the landmark collection, The Bible and Feminism, Joseph Marshall upbraids recent feminist scholarship for what he calls, in the essay, pink-washing Paul. Marshall borrows the term pinkwashing from feminist and queer activists working in contexts of corporate capitalism. He uses the term to signal how, quote, an ostensibly progressive or advanced stance towards sexual minorities can operate as a marketing strategy that provides cover for other activities. And in particular how, quote, certain constrained forms and norms of freedom, safety, or protection operate to direct and even expand violence, end quote. So to pinkwash in this usage is to dress up something that is bad for women and queer folk in the disguise of something that is good for women and queer folk. It is to put a wolf in sheep's clothing, one might say, to make deception a means to the end of cruelty. Now, Marshall sees this pernicious dynamic at work in interpretation of the letters of Paul, not among, say, right-wing fundamentalists, but rather among progressive feminists. He singles out for censure works by two leading feminist interpreters of the last generation. First, Brigitte Kahl's reading of the letter to the Galatians as a complaint against Roman imperial co-opting of indigenous Jewish law. And second, Kathy Ahrensberger's constructive reading of Paul's letters for what she calls a theology of mutuality. In Marshall's analysis, both Kahl's and Ahrensberger's readings fail, both commit the sin of pinkwashing, because they try to use for good something that is, by Marshall's lights, objectively bad. He concludes about them, quote, such efforts to isolate one aspect as distinctively redeeming about the figure of Paul, bequeathing a positive ethic to women now, look increasingly like an evasion or cover for the perpetuation of violent and oppressive structures, end quote. Second example. This 2021 book by Kevin Concannon, who argues that the letters of Paul are irredeemably bad and that efforts to read them constructively, and he criticizes, for instance, Brian Blunt and Ward Blanton on this score, are a fool's errand. About such efforts, Concannon writes, quote, is this necessary or wise or even possible? Can Paul be redeemed? Can an archive of texts that supported slavery, demonized Jews, propped up dictators, naturalized the submission of women, and endorsed a whole host of other atrocities be welcomed into the struggle against racism, capitalism, fascism, and other ills? I argue no, end quote. The logic of Concannon's no, he explains in the book, is roughly as follows. If Paul could not even bring himself to condemn slavery, then what use are Paul's letters to us, who have our own very urgent ethical and political problems to attend to? Concannon writes, quote, why should anyone looking for resources to challenge neoliberal capitalism or the rising currents of racist fascism trust the insight of someone who couldn't see that the forced bondage of human beings was an unconscionable wrong? Why does someone like that remain scripturally or culturally relevant? End quote. Now, the answer to that is, I think, embedded in the question. As James Kugel, Hebrew Bible scholar, argues in this excellent book, scriptural relevance is a kind of relevance that transcends whatever the historical person Paul may or may not have thought or done or indeed even written. When Paul wrote his letters, they were not yet scripture. But as soon as they became scripture, they became something a great deal more than just Paul's letters. With that development, it became possible, nay, inevitable, for Paul's letters to mean vastly differently from how they originally meant. As regards the issue of slavery, at least, one could argue that is for the better. And we'll have more to say about that in just a moment. There is, in my view, although I'm criticizing it, a lot of good in this recent flurry of bad Bible research. Some of it is, I think, therapeutic for the authors and for some readers as well, which I take to be a genuinely good thing. What is more, it has rightly unmasked one hermeneutical maneuver which is all too common among religious readers, including scholars, namely a kind of naive quarantining of the so-called text itself, on the one hand, from its entire effective history, on the other hand. Historically speaking, there is no bright line between the former and the latter, between text and reception. So if, say, Marcion or John Chrysostom can come in for criticism, then by all rights the Apostle Paul can too. To the extent, then, that this 21st century bad Bible has put moral criticism back on the agenda of biblical studies, alongside historical criticism, not in place of it, I would want to suggest, it is a thing greatly to be welcomed. The 19th century studied avoidance of the question, which we discussed above, was never going to be sustainable in the long run. And yet, as it has been executed so far, the Bad Bible Project, I think, is liable to at least two, formidable criticisms. First of all, it trades heavily on the myth of textual agency. That is, the alluring, but nevertheless false idea that texts speak or act independently of their human interpreters. I have in mind, for instance, the idea, noted above, that the letters of Paul wrought enormous human suffering in the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was an evil of world historical proportions, and many of its architects and functionaries cited the letters of Paul to justify their actions. And they did so not without some textual warrant. But the letters of Paul did not effect the slave trade. European enslavers did that. And to say so is not to valorize the letters or their ancient authors, who of course were human actors accountable for their actions. It is just to say that texts do not hurt people. People hurt people. Texts, even biblical texts, do not do anything until people read them and put them to use. Texts are not agents. Consequently, the Bible is no more bad in and of itself than it is good in and of itself. Because it is a book and not a person, it is not, nor could it possibly be, bad or good in the fulsome moral sense that we normally apply those terms to human actors. The Bad Bible Project misses this point, I think, ironically, in exactly the same way that popular discourse about the good book misses this point. Second criticism. As it has been executed so far, the Bad Bible Project is so zealously committed to paranoid reading that it leaves no room for reparative reading. Now, these terms come, as some of you will know, from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's famous essay, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading. Or, you're so paranoid, you probably think this essay is about you. For Sedgwick, who's drawing on Freud here, paranoid reading, which is a cousin to Ricoeur's hermeneutic of suspicion, is all about forestalling pain, while reparative reading positively seeks out pleasure. Sedgwick's worry is that the former disposition has a tendency to crowd out the latter. She writes, quote, "Paranoia has by now candidly become less a diagnosis than a prescription. In a world where no one need be delusional to find evidence of systemic oppression, to theorize out of anything but a paranoid critical stance has come to seem naive, pious, or complacent," end quote. But, Sedgwick argues, this impression of complacency is false. There is, she says, there must still be room for reparative reading as well. Quote, "It seems to me a great loss when paranoid inquiry comes to seem entirely coextensive with critical theoretical inquiry, rather than being viewed as one kind of cognitive, affective, theoretical practice among other alternative kinds," end quote. And this is my complaint with the Bad Bible discourse of the 2020s of our era. I think that my Bad Bible colleagues and friends worry that if we fail to keep up a vigilant hermeneutic of suspicion, then injustice might slip through unnoticed, or worse, become naturalized and normalized. But this fear is, as Sedgwick argues, I think, not warranted. She points out that our different ways of reading, paranoid, reparative, and other ways beside, do not stand in a zero-sum relation with one another. Quoting Sedgwick, to practice other than paranoid forms of knowing does not in itself entail a denial of the reality or gravity of enmity or oppression, end quote. So if injustice happens, as of course it often does, it is not because we were not reading suspiciously enough. It is because people do awful things, sometimes using texts or other cultural artifacts as their tools, which is tragic, but not a good reason for us to resolve only always to read suspiciously. After all, it is impossible to succeed entirely at forestalling pain, whereas it is possible to seek and to find quite a lot of pleasure, to do quite a lot of good in the world. Or in other words, there is such a thing as too much paranoia, but there's no such thing as too much reparation. Which brings us to that more excellent way, finally, that I promised to show you. Right here in the city of Edinburgh, just off Tollcross, at 33 Gilmore Place, there is a house that was once home to Frederick Douglass, the great American statesman and abolitionist who had escaped slavery in Maryland. Douglass spent several years traveling throughout Scotland, urging Scottish Christians, with remarkable success, actually, to divest from financial interests with their slave-holding American co-religionists. A main theme of Douglass's Scottish speeches is the claim that, contrary to what American Christian enslavers were arguing, the Bible did not justify them in their resolution to buy and sell other human beings. Christian enslavers could not hide behind the Bible, Douglass insisted. They would be judged according to their own works. In one remarkable speech that he gave in Glasgow in 1860, Douglass said this: "They have declared that the Bible sanctions slavery. What do we do in such a case? What do you do when you are told by the slaveholders of America that the Bible sanctions slavery? Do you go and throw your Bible in the fire? Do you sing out, 'No union with the Bible'? Do you declare that a thing is bad because it has been misused, abused, and made bad use of? Do you throw it away on that account? No, you press it to your bosom all the more closely. You read it all the more diligently, and you prove from its pages that it is on the side of liberty and not on the side of slavery." End quote. Now today, in 2024, more or less all parties, thank God, agree that whatever the Bible may or may not say, we must not countenance the enslavement of other human beings. But as we have seen, it remains a very live dispute whether or to what extent we should concede that the Bible, or any part of it, is in fact on the side of slavery. In her recent remarkable book on this issue, Lisa Bowens argues, in the tradition of Douglass, that we should not. So great is the hermeneutical agency of the reader, Bowens argues, that even the canonical Paul, whose fateful line, "Slaves, obey your masters," Colossians 3 and Ephesians 6, has been party to such catastrophic harm down the centuries, even he need not and ought not be ceded to the side of slavery. The proof of Bowens' claim is her rich reception history of the letters of Paul in African American interpretation from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. Drawing on her Herculean feat of archival research, Bowens shows us a kaleidoscope of readings of Paul by Black American readers from across the centuries. They come in the form of slave petitions, autobiographies, conversion narratives, letters, sermons, speeches, and other genres beside. Their interpretations are very diverse, but one red thread emerges overwhelmingly clearly in Bowens's history, namely a persistent appeal to Paul as a resource for liberation. There is an alternative reading strategy, attested in some of her sources, which reads Paul as a kind of slavery apologist over against Jesus as a liberator, but it is by far the minority report. One fascinating test of Bowens's claim is the tally of which Pauline texts Black American interpreters have enlisted in their struggle for justice. Interestingly, Galatians 3:28, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, which is a favorite of many more progressive readers in recent decades, gets very little attention. Meanwhile, however, the first epistle to Timothy turns out to be a tremendously important resource for Black anti-slavery interpreters in the 19th century. For instance, Frederick Douglass, when defenders of the Fugitive Slave Act cited Paul's letter to Philemon in support of their cause, Douglass argued that Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon as a free person, not a slave. Because, this is Douglass's argument, according to Paul in 1 Timothy 10, man-stealing, andropodisteia, is contrary to sound doctrine. So if Paul expressly condemns man-stealing in 1 Timothy, he cannot be made to endorse slaving elsewhere, so argues Douglass. Another example, David Walker, who was born in North Carolina to a free mother and an enslaved father, in his appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble, to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America, identifies white, pro-slavery Christian preachers with the demonic false teachers prophesied in 1 Timothy 4. The Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by giving heed to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, through the pretensions of liars whose consciences have been seared. Upon reflection, I cannot think of a better interpretation of this text than David Walker's. Now, Nancy Ambrose was, of course, entirely within her rights to insist, as she famously did, that once freed from slavery, she would choose never to hear the letters of Paul preached to her again. But the reason why Ambrose's resolution is so compelling is precisely her own agency as an interpreter, and not any naked feature of the letters themselves. And the same is true of Frederick Douglass's reading of man-stealing in 1 Timothy 1, or David Walker's reading of the conscience-seared liars in 1 Timothy 4. We may be grateful that the author of 1 Timothy wrote these lines, but it is Douglass and Walker we have to thank for putting them to wise, urgent, ethical use in those dark days of the American Republic. They did with their scriptures exactly what religious readers ought to do with their scriptures. They made the most of them, and they made the best of them. Finally then, the Bible is, strictly speaking, neither a good book nor a bad book. It is a protean book, patient of conscription into, and in fact, being conscripted into, a variety of causes. A variety of causes as wide as human endeavor itself. We, the generation now living, are responsible for how we use it, if we use it at all. And of course, we are very free to choose not to use it. Those of us who are religiously invested in it will have good reason to. Others of us will not, which is as it should be. But if we do use it, then it seems to me the more reparative reading, the better. In almost all the cases I can think of, to put a biblical text to good, liberative use in the world is not self-serving or apologetic or dishonest. Quite the contrary. It is a moral credit to the modern person who recognizes the enormous power she wields as an interpreter. Haley Gabriel, in a brilliant recent article on Galatians 4, makes this point better than I can, so I will quote her. Quote, I take for granted that some of the connections I make here might surprise the historical Paul, but I see them as arising naturally and bountifully out of the variegated text that he composed. Rather than drawing violent and life-shattering patterns out of this letter, I am interested in tracing fruitful and life-generating possibilities." End quote. Exactly so. The biblical authors are long dead, but we are not. We still have agency in the world. So as Renton in Trainspotting reminds us, and before Renton, Moses in Deuteronomy, we can choose life or not. But to read the Bible thoughtfully, deliberately, toward justice is one way. It is only one way, but it's a good one, to choose life. Thank you for your attention.